Hi, everyone. We are doing something new today on this channel. We are starting a poetry workshop series where we're going to present the poems that we ourselves work on. If some of you guys haven't realized it yet, I have a bunch of poems on my YouTube channel here. If you look at some of the shorts, for example, I have arios that we're going to discuss. I wrote some fresh for this show. Laura Woods is with me. She's a talented poet from Ireland, soon to be Scotland, at least for a little bit. And so we're going to do this simply because there really isn't anything like this on the internet, right? Poetry has not only completely fallen by the wayside. I can't imagine anybody just sitting down with their current perspectives on poetry and on writing and thinking, you know what, we need to all get together and try to figure out, get to the bottom of how to make something better, right? How to improve a poem. Because most people, they don't even view poetry, right, as something that could be objectively improved in any way. So we're going to try to change that. And hopefully we're going to have other people down the road, right? There's a bunch of poets that we all know. So getting together, having diverse perspectives, I think that's going to be interesting to look at. And we're also going to introduce some poems, right? Some from names, right? People that are more well known. I have John Ashbery right here. We're going to be taking a look at the first poem in his classic self-portrait in a convex mirror collection. I have right here Dan Schneider's Omni Sonnets, right? So this is one of his sonnet collections, and we're going to discuss one of the sonnets from here. This is an OG text going back like 15 years when I first started reading Cosmoetica material, and I started physically myself printing out the books because this is like before the age of Kindle, and I didn't want to like read PDFs on a computer, nor did I want to just print out pages. So I used to have these bounded. And we're going to discuss a poem by Robinson Jeffers, and we're going to discuss some other poetry as well. And we're going to split this into two shows. There's going to be a patron-only show afterwards. So it's going to be like a few poems from us now, and then a few more. For me, it's going to be actually in the patron show. I'm going to have poems that are a bit more personal, right? Stuff that maybe I don't want to be so public. So if you want to feel, guys, if you want to feel like you have a power social relationship with me, give me a little bit of money, just $5 a month. You're going to feel like you really, really know me. And you're going to get access to.
25 bucks get those like priceless voyeuristic urges fulfilled.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, $5 for this versus what you get elsewhere, right? I feel like you get a lot more bang for your buck with stuff like this because, we're really putting in work, right? So a lot of these poems took me a long time to put together because I'm just not a fast writer. And I guess maybe let's just kind of like jump into it right now, right? I'm going to read one of my poems and Laura's going to offer her response. So this is a poem that you guys have already seen if you're a follower of this channel. I did a YouTube short on it, and you could find that now. You could see the little video and performance of it. But I actually want to discuss it a bit because there's some worthwhile stuff here to talk about. So I'm going to read it first, and we're going to get Laura's response. So, and before anything, this is an ario. And an ario poetic form is something that was invented by the late Minneapolis poet Bruce Ario. He died, it was sometime in August of 2022. If you guys follow this channel, you saw that I did a couple of shows on his life and work. There's a bunch of essays on his life and work on the automachination.com website. And we are releasing the first book under the Automachination imprint is going to be a book of Bruce Ario's poetry. It's going to be his selected poems that Dan Schneider put together. So that's going to be coming out sometime in the first few months of 2024. So these are the ario poetic forms, right? It's 3 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines, followed by a final line that is supposed to serve some sort of twist, some kind of inversion, some sort of deeper comment, something, right? In the same way that sonnets have that sort of relationship a little bit going on as well. So this is my ario instructions for a deteriorating life vest. I've lost count of ways to lose it all, though hope remains the biggest culprit. I had hoped to never have to move again from the bed with the big blonde pencil, picking sore spots like Mengele rocked open on a swim. Hope? One can only pack the lungs with hope. A poem floats better than a body, as a poem flows better than a poem.
I remember you sending this to me actually, an earlier version of it, and then like
Which
this
is
one.
like which was lame, right?
Yeah,
And we're going to talk about that. Yeah.
it was interesting. I feel like the Mangala aspect or like illusion kind of like was a later addition to it. It was so that was interesting to see how that kind of opened up the poem in a different direction, really. Um, I don't know. I feel like it's there's a lot of those little like Bruce like kind of touches or like the little things you get from it. So like you have a lot of this kind of like playing off of like expected tropes or even cliches. Like you have hope remains, and then the biggest culprit. So you have like that's an excellent enjambment there. Like the first stanza in general and the way it plays off of the title. Excellent title by the way. I can't remember what the original one was, but it's much more interesting. It's a good title, works well. The opening stanza then like that set enjambment in the second line, that is an excellent one. So like you kind of like you get that little cliche working in an ironic way, but then like it's also subverted entirely with the second part of the sentence then. Um Same for like then you have a kind of a similar effect. The second stanza I think is then you're moving away a little bit from I find it interesting. I'm going to have to like think on that a bit more, like the sort of implications of that. The second line and second stanza, you nearly have like this like almost it seems like it could be like a weird like quasi sexual diversion or whatever. And then like again, the third line kind of pulls you back and you have the Mengalatine, which sort of brings you back to the conceit of the title. So like if you know like how he drowned. Um Rocked open on a swim again like you have this on that you kind of have the word play you kind of get the like on like play off of like on a whim but this kind of almost like blasé sort of way of alluding to his drowning which that like plays off of title it has this almost like this whimsical kind of irreverent tone to it which like is fitting of the fact it's an aerial that kind of form lends itself to that um and what hope. Okay, so I'll just read the end bit as well. Like hope, one can only pack the lungs with hope. A poem floats better than a body, as a poem flows better than a poem. So kind of my interpretation when I read this, I feel like you get a few of it is kind of the like dual meaning of poem like maybe it's implying some degree of hierarchy in poetry like I guess
Mhm.
that even there's like a qualitative nature to art that like because the whole aspect of like legacy or a poem floats better than a body like as in the art transcending like the physical form or the physical kind of aspect of the artist. But then also like the hierarchical nature of art itself, like some poems literally flowing better. I think there's like other things that you could sort of bring into that or interpret it, but that's just the immediate like meaning or interpretation that comes to me. I think it's an interesting poem. I think like it does work very well. It works within the form quite well too because it's sort of like you're able to have a little bit of enigma to it that sort of plays off this very definitive title and like it kind of can come back to it in different ways. It just sort of like stands out because I've seen some of the other areas you've done, but I think I still feel like this one is probably one of the best examples out of the ones of yours I've read so far, including some of the others in the show, of just kind of taking these techniques that like I think kind of Bruce just naturally sort of innovated in like a lot of his best areas, like some of the ones that have been posted, I guess, on your channel as well. That they're sort of he'll like sort of have these like almost cliched terms and sort of play off them in a whimsical way. But like this subject matter of this poem is a lot has a lot more darker allusions than like most of Bruce's things do. But you're still sort of using those same techniques in the same way, and I think it's just I don't know. It gives obviously it's something that like it's playing off of things outside of the world of the poem itself in a way that's very interesting as well with the whole manga allusions too, because like I was kind of, I had to think when looking at it first when I saw it, and it was like, oh, right. And tying it back to the title again, it does it in quite an oblique way, but it definitely opens up a lot more of, it just opens a lot more implications then, because it kind of makes me think too of like some of those, I guess, like commentaries or philosophy regarding like art and violence, or like, creation, destruction, like all the classical kind of things like that. So it's also, especially when it's alluded like pencil picking sore spots like Mengele, you have that sort of implication woven in there. So that then comes back like again the dichotomy of a poem and a body in the ninth line. So like I kind of, yeah, I think it's one I definitely come back to, as it's kind of, it kind of like it's a more oblique, like there's definitely like multiple interpretations we've gone out, but like even just like on looking after a couple of reads and looking at it now, it's it just kind of like it plays around by a lot of these ideas in quite like a playful way, and it gives you a lot to chew on kind of. So
Yeah, I agree that this Ario is the best one here, and also like alongside the Tyree Nichols one that's also available
mm,
on YouTube
yeah,
Shorts, right? That's also they're similar in the sense that to your point about Bruce Ario having these kinds of like nostalgic and like semi sort of like emotional aspects, and yet I'm always sort of taking it perhaps in a darker direction, and also B in a much more maybe argumentative, rhetorical direction
yeah,
as well. Because I mean, Bruce, when he started, I guess in his adult life, he had intended to become a lawyer. He got into a driving accident, and because of his traumatic brain injury, he could not sort of complete law school or whatever. So his mind went into a different direction, whereas mine, I still, despite having this like significant interest in the arts and in poetry, a lot of my mind is still very it's very kind of rhetorical and political focused. As to like the original versions of this poem, like so like the first version that I sent Laura like maybe like a couple months ago was I like to use the word lame for a lot of stuff, simply because when it applies to poetry, there's this feeling that there's something about it that's like crippled and insufficient and
just
not.
falls flat. Like it's like, oh, this
Yeah,
is nice.
exactly.
It's
Yeah,
like when you
exactly.
hear a joke, but instead of like laughing at it, someone just goes, "That's so funny." Like
Yes. Yeah, yeah. So,
it's
so,
yeah.
so let me just like talk about what the differences were. So first of all, originally when I was writing it, I was sort of looking at like the kind of like bear market in the markets over the past 18 months or so. And I sort of like was like designing a kind of like poem for traders, right? Like day traders, whatever, swing traders. And but I mean, first of all, just kind of conceptually, it's not that you can't do, excellent to great poetry on that topic, but it does sort of you're gonna have to sort of expand further and further out. And for me, like when I started expanding further out, it simply went in a different direction, and you're gonna have to be okay with that. So originally, like if you think about it, so like the opening stanza, I've lost count of ways to lose it all. The hope remains the biggest culprit. If you're in the markets, or you're an investor, or you're a trader of some sort, if you're going to approach the markets specifically through the lens of I have hope that X, Y, and Z will happen, right? You're going to lose all your money, because the market is not going to cater to any of your hopes, right? You need to have a strategy, an objective plan where it actually doesn't matter what the market does, right? If the market doesn't necessarily go in your direction, that's fine. You might take a tiny loss and it's done. So this idea that you're simply going to have a hope that's going to multiply losses, right? Hope remains the biggest culprit. And as you said earlier, yeah, this is a cliche, though hope remains. And I knew that as I was writing it, I was like, all right, this is 100% a cliche. The point now is to totally subvert it, right? And I'm now treating hope as a culprit, right? As something negative, something to be wary of. When I sort of started going away from the idea of, like this shouldn't be just like a poem about trading, like it's clearly going a different direction. I started thinking about like, well, what kind of hopes, right, did I have as a kid? Or like I remember, and this is probably going to be applied to you and also other people who are interested in the arts watching this. When I was growing up, right, I decided as a teenager, you know what, maybe I could be a writer. But that was still at the stage where you could see people living off of their writing. You could see people
Mm,
writing books, and that's just kind of like their job, right? There were still folks like Kazuo Shiguru who essentially wrote a couple of great books when they were younger, and we're like, they don't have to necessarily work. They could just sort of coast off of that and then just have like a novel, every X number of years. And I thought, this is a place that I could fit into as, as a kid and then as an adult. And little by little, all of that started to go away, right? Now, for instance, if you want to be a writer, a ton of time is going to be spent, doing shows like this, doing podcasts. You're going to be churning out content. The point is you have to cultivate a following outside of the books themselves first, simply because people are just not that interested in reading anymore. And when they do read, it tends to be articles or audiobooks. With poetry, you cannot read poetry as audio, right? You can't, because there's some benefits to that in some ways, but you can't, for instance, understand what's going on in the enjambment, right? It's definitely
yeah.
a much more visual literary form compared to
As
something
well
like
as
a
there being
novel, you know?
a lot of poems that do depend on the visual. And I don't just mean in like the Cummings sense of like when they do like tricky stuff with it, but like there's oftentimes a lot of poems they just have a certain look on the page, like line length, things like that, that just really add to the whole experience of it. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in the next stanza, I'm sort of alluding to maybe some of these memories that I had as a kid. And it's almost as if like, well, not that you would necessarily even know this reading the poem, but when I was growing up, I had to do a lot of moving around, which I hated, right? I always thought I always knew people that were like in the same apartment or the same house from birth until like early adulthood. And I would always tell them, you don't understand how lucky you are. And they always felt like, no, I'm not lucky. I'm bored. And I've always craved the stability of the classic thing, right? You always crave what you don't have. So crave the stability. So it's like, all right, this first line, right? It's almost as if I'm talking about, physical like relocation, right? I had hoped to never have to move again, right? Next line is very, very different. From the bed with the big blonde. You think there's something almost sexual going on. Then you get pencil, right? So clearly I'm talking about something with writing, right? Pencil picking sore spots like Mengele. The reason why I wanted to use the Mengele line is there is something painful, right, about being an artist, especially if you want to make a living specifically off of the art. And like James Baldwin says, right, if you want to be a writer, there's always going to be a sense, especially early on in your life, that the whole world is in a conspiracy against you and your craft, right? They're trying to prevent you from being a writer. They're trying to keep you away from your craft. They're trying to tell you, no, 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 you have to go get a job. You have to do this. You have to do that. You have to be useful, because their definition of being useful to society is going to be different. You sometimes see either poetry or art or whatever referencing Mengele, and it tends to be in the kind of like a more cliched sense of let's just like focus on the viciousness, right, of like a
Mm,
Nazi doctor or whatever. Let's focus on that. Here I'm almost drawing a connection between us two, and later on there's a divergence, right? So pencil picking sore spots like Mengele, rocked open on the swim, right? This is as far as I'm treating it, right? I'm not like spending all this time like, and oh my god, and he died and there's all this justice served because of that. Great, he's out of a life, but and also like rocked open, meaning he who knows how exactly would have happened. Maybe floating down, maybe he hit a bunch of
yeah, it
rocks.
has sort of like a graphic implication as well. Like
Yeah,
if you
and
think about, but you don't
yeah,
have to like think about that much detail. It's quite a nice,
yeah,
succinct like,
yeah.
and
It's a
but it
short line,
also because the title then like it works. The title pulls a lot of weight with that too because it sort of immediately folds it back into like some sort of larger metaphor that
Yeah.
like you when you're reading this you go like so that's what that's and referring to. So it sort of prepares you then for the last three lines to kind of have a bit of a greater weight or greater implication than they otherwise would.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it works pretty. I think the Mengele reference and it being specifically there sort of works pretty well for
Yeah.
the ending of the poem. It definitely gives it a lot of weight.
Yeah, and the reason why the original version of the poem didn't really work about markets or trading or whatever is because it lacked that grander scope. It's not that you
Yeah.
can't write poems about literally almost whatever topic that you want, but you need to have eventually some kind of grander scope. We have it here. The fact that it's a very short line, pretty arresting, right? We don't have to linger here. It's just there. Now we move on to the philosophy, right? So what is the philosophy, and what is this deteriorating life vest? Well, hope, one can only pack the lungs with hope. A poem floats better than a body, as a poem flows better than a poem. So instead of moralizing about wasn't Mengele so evil? Isn't Nazism so bad? As if there's anybody that would really disagree with this, right? Who's not just a total psychopath outside of polite society. Instead of doing that, I'm now sort of like I'm a little bit turning the tables on even like modern liberals who would agree with me, obviously, that Nazism is bad. But here I'm saying, look, if we're gonna make the determination that there is evil in the world, and there are people that by way of being evil, they are not constructive forces but destructive forces, right? If we're going to say that about people, if we could make those kinds of ethical judgments, and we could make objective ethical judgments, can't we have the same kind of judgments about other kinds of phenomena, right? You could have similar judgments when it comes to poetry, right? When it comes to art, right? And my hope, and why this feels like it's a deteriorating life vest is, my hope is that a poem floats better than a body, right? I can get beyond the issues of everyday sort of like meager existence through something like poetry, right? Which stands above in some way.
Mentioning him instead of like Goebbels or someone else like that involved in the Nazis, that he was a doctor, and there's this aspect with the medical experiments. So like it gives like even like the body, like that particular word, it gives it a certain weight and implications as well. Like, it kind of, I don't know, I do think that's a good choice there. And it's like kind of a novel way to like weave in the whole, not just are Nazis evil, but it's the whole, like the whole like art, like these kind of evil acts, like the values associated with them, like in a wider way. It's not just good or bad. So,
but I think there's something to the core perception that in the same way that we discuss ethics as, there's an objective way of discussing ethics, there's objectivity in right and wrong, but you still have to come from a set of like, core assumptions and values that are not so easy to prove logically, and perhaps you can't even prove them logically. The same thing would apply to the arts, right? The core assumptions would be something like, well, I believe that writing with fewer cliches is better than writing with tons of cliches, right? Somebody could
like,
yeah.
If you get into this argument, I'm sure like I have and you have, it always like you're going to get met with it. But why? But what if I like cliches? But what if cliches?
It will be exactly this.
That's what
this
you get.
Poem is the answer, but the poem is the answer to that, right? The answer is, Mengele could say, there's actually no logical ought that requires of me to be a good person the way that you define
it's like,
it.
Why shouldn't I experiment on people even that requires torture? Like why shouldn't I do this? Like why are you any better writing poems that may or may not be shit? Like
exactly. So the same sort of idea would apply here. Well, if we start with a bunch of values, right? Because the way that I view it is just like constructive versus non-constructive. You could say, perfectly well, I love cliches. That's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. That's fine. What I'm saying is, just like Mengele, by being a non-constructive force, he's ultimately going to disappear and be like totally shit upon by history. Those people that are saying like there's no objectivity in the arts and I could do whatever that I want and everything's equally valid, history is also going to take a big fucking shit on them, right? And that's irrespective of what they believe, right? So there's and I want to explore all of this like a lot more deeply, perhaps with a book or whatever much later on, where I feel like,
or even a longer poem, I feel. But I do think like even going back to like just the more micro levels as well as the macro ones, I feel like there's something to kind of having a shorter poem where you like really like explore, just zoom in on a certain facet of this issue. And like even just to mention, I brought it up before, but I do, one of the things I do think, like I said, I do think this is one of your strongest arios, and even little things like in the final line you have as a poem flows better than a poem. It's like one of those little like dualities that it's just one of those things. It's like a little record skip or something like that that just like
Hmm.
hooks your brain, and you straight away go like, well, hang on a second, like what, it makes you kind of think about um what would be the difference between the way poems are being used. It kind of unfolds the things. It's a very good, it's a very strong ending line, especially in the context of this kind of form, because it does catch you a little bit. It's like having like, like a little particular harmony in a song or something that just like hits you differently or something when you go back to listen to it. Like
Hmm.
so it's a pretty good technique. And I feel like that's the kind of things that they can really hit hard when it's like 1/10 of a whole poem versus maybe like you're saying a novel or even a longer poem. You can sort of imply or like kind of lead the reader into like thinking about the philosophical implications of like, well, the difference between two poems, and that kind of then opening up all these other ideas of value judgments, versus in something longer where even in a longer poem you'd have to tease that and like explore that in a more overt sense to really make it carry the same psychological weight. Like, whereas something short like this, like I am just even sitting here listening to you talk, and I'm still kind of digesting it after having read it a few times. As like those little things, those little individual choices like carry a lot more weight in the way a reader processes them. So yeah, I think it's like it's a pretty strong way to like have explore. I know I think the whole arios and like inform works well for these kind of rhetorical or these kind of deeper things because it forces you to deal with them, but as a writer approaching it, but also in the reader, it forces you to sort of digest these issues in a different way that you would, in something that's more trying to explore the totality of a subject like that.
Hmm.
It's kind of like, like because we talk about Nietzsche, it's kind of like an aphorism. It's dealing with something in aphorisms as opposed to a treatise in a more classical sense. Like you have to you think of it differently. You like
Yeah.
slow down and like digest these different facets differently and give them individual aspects more weight. So
Yeah. And I mean, I'm still holding out hope, right? With this deteriorating life vest.
yeah,
I mean, it
it's
could,
instructions for it. It implies there's some
yeah.
kind of like holding on to it. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, as we watch to see what develops like in the poetry world, in the art world, whether or not artists can actually live on anything other than seems like NFTs right now, or maybe professorships. Is there some other way? So I guess we'll see. I guess we could talk about this as well now, right? Because it has like
Yeah.
some
It
coherence with,
flows pretty naturally into it. No pun
yeah.
intended. But yeah, I suppose I don't know if you want to read it out because it's quite long. Maybe just some if there's any particular sections.
Yeah, maybe some of it simply because yeah, it is very
Yeah.
long.
So I suppose, yeah, if anyone's listening, it's What We Know of Death by Drowning by Nick Lantz. So
Yeah.
it's worth looking up and kind of looking at it. Because I think it's personally, I wasn't familiar with this poem before you sent it to me, and I do think it's an interesting one. It's one that like okay, structurally or the sort of variations on a theme kind of structure is one that I personally like. I'm quite fond of. I like doing series of poems and sonnets and stuff like that. So I can start. There's a certain appeal or there's a certain way of like writing. I think of getting little things, little segments that don't necessarily fully stand alone, but they can play off each other in ways to kind of make a coherent whole. Like that's something that can be a very strong approach. But I do think in here, like it's definitely even looking at the individual parts, it's like um yeah, I mean, even just the Josef Mengele like specific section is not. It doesn't carry a particular lot of interest or implications outside of this is Josef Mengele, and this is what happened to him. I think honestly, a lot of the other individual segments of this poem approach their subject matter in a more interesting and just deeper sort of way than this one does. I mean,
Mhm.
honestly, I think this one doesn't particularly add very much either in and of itself or even to the whole of the poem and sort of playing off the other sections and the whole. Some of the other ones will use nearly the idea of drowning in various ways. It's used as a metaphor, this contrast between these different kinds of drowning or whatever, that like there's a bit more thought put into it. I don't know. I didn't feel this first section really um it really did that, to be honest. Like there's some good lines here and there within the poem, but yeah, it is quite patchy, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah, so basically, what we know of "Death by Drowning" by Nick Lantz. This is a contemporary poet. This poem itself was written sometime in the last 15 years. He makes
2010, I think. So
yeah,
it
yeah,
says at the
because
bottom.
yeah, he makes a reference to something that happened in 2009. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you, right? So this is kind of like if you look at a poem like Wallace Stevens's 13 Ways
13 Ways, yeah.
of looking at a
Or
blackbird, right?
decorations, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I guess themes and motifs, kind of like again and again and again. And it's you could do this, but like you said earlier, right? Like, what exactly are we cohering to overall, right? What exactly are we trying to say? Or even not like say is kind of, it's kind of a trite to do that. Is there some sort of like totalizing function? And I don't
What
really
is,
think
I think it's like,
here.
I like to think of it as what is being said. So it's like, what, not what are you trying to say, because you can try and fail, but like when you actually look at the poem in the end, well, is there something being said that justifies it? Because,
Yeah.
that's just how it is. Sometimes you write something, be like, like it doesn't really achieve that, and you just try again. But
This is part one of the poem. Josef Mengele drowns while swimming at a beach in Brazil, 1979. His name then, Wolfgang Gerhard. How easy slipping on another man's skin. Another country, too. Its sun's heat and light as insistent as a pair of forceps. His pants left crumpled on the beach, forged papers and a few hard candies in the pocket. Where the water was shallow, he could look down and see his shadow passing over the pale sand, a wobbly twin, matching him stroke for stroke for stroke. So, first of all, and this kind of like is a problem for much of the sections of the poem where there's not like a lot of trust that is placed in the brain of the reader. Like, I mean, with my Mangala poem, I never, really gave an explanation. I just put it up as a short, and I essentially said, "Okay, kids, you figure it out, right?" Because I'm fine with it, right? I think everything is really kind of self-contained. Here, there's not a lot of trust. Like, first of all, he has to give all this sort of like background information. And not only does he give it the title, which is perfectly fine, right? I often make titles that are just nothing but the background information to contextualize a poem.
yeah,
But then it's like, his name then, Wolfgang Gerhard, like it's not exactly a good start, right? Because we already have like by having the title itself, you don't even need this part because we already
yeah.
know what has transpired, right? We have,
Unless I think like unless he was going to the thing is, it's like it just seems like it's a bunch of like ideas thrown at you that don't go anywhere. So the idea of like, okay, how easy slipping on another man's skin. Okay, that in itself is a conceit. Like if you're going to do a poem about Mangala, you could like that idea could be an interesting one to play with. But then it's like nothing is really done with it. So it's just ends up like it states this fact and it doesn't really have a lot of
yeah.
like any psychological weight behind it in terms of it's not painting a portrait of him. It's not really, it's like at best, like if you really wanted to play devil's advocate for the poem, you could like say it's setting up this like idea of a double that then plays into the whole thing of the shadow at the end. But that's also an incredibly trite approach, and especially talking about an evil man. So like
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
it's like that isn't even a particularly good defense of the poem. It's not really helping its case very much. Like it's
Yeah.
yeah,
And here you sort of have like glimmers of something that could be possible, like how easy
yeah.
slipping on another man's skin. I mean, that's, I'm guessing there must be some sort of reference here going on to like, the Nazi lampshades and all that other shit.
Hmm.
At the same time, it is like a little bit trite to like sort of dwell on that. And also there's the problem, like he often has this in the rest of these sections. He has all these mixed metaphors and descriptions like, okay, how easy slipping on another man's skin. We know that that is like a stock phrase to slip on someone's skin, someone's disguise, someone's mask. But what, slipping on another country, that's, it's like as if he didn't really know what to
Yeah.
say, so he just put it on. And then of course like its sun's heat and light as insistent as a pair a forceps. Like you sort of know exactly where this is going. You know
Yeah,
exactly
it's
where the
like, oh, it's a
reference is
medical
to.
instrument, but it's like it's
Yeah.
not something. If he'd gone maybe for something that had some sort of degree of coherence with the established metaphor, slipping on another man's skin, okay, maybe it'd be trite, but at least would have that, like it would be a hook, it would have some bit of like coherence, which is
Yeah.
like I find that a lot, honestly, in a lot of more contemporary poetry that doesn't work. It's like they'll sort of throw out these metaphors that are supposed to be arresting, but they're not, they never cohere. There's no sense of like a natural link or using metaphors that kind of play off each other interestingly to sort of build the momentum and bring the poem forward. Like even within, like to go back to like your one, you sort of you have like certain images, like you have the life vest idea, you have, you know, even when you like you talking about a body, talking about the pencil, it's like also the coheres, you know, works with sort of central image and plays off each other. And there are implications even with the use of Mengele. This is just like throwing out various things that like, okay, maybe they cohere on the level of they're like somewhat gruesome or bodily associations that play off of what we know about Mengele, but they don't also play off each other. So basically is only working on one level of metaphorical coherency or whatever you want to call it. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And like honestly, when I saw this part as insistent as a pair of forceps, I immediately knew, oh, okay, so my
Mhm.
Mangala reference, it's gonna have to be different, right? I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to, first of all, you know, I'm picking the sore spots like Mengele, and in fact, they're also in a different way picking me, right? Because the or you know, writing can often be painful in that way.
Well,
You know,
yeah,
there's
it's also a use of passive voice. It's kind of like the big pencil picking sore spots. It's not saying like who's holding this pencil, how is it picking the sore spots,
exactly.
picking sore spots, and who or what exactly. So, you know, you could read the poem a few times and like kind of make and think of different approaches or different ways you want to read it or different active forces within it, kind of.
Yeah,
It's
and
like it's giving you like it's giving you a bit of variety. It's giving you like open options to like interpret within that, really, which
yeah.
is like one of the things the Nick Lantz poem just really doesn't do, even in some of the better sections.
hmm and I mean the thing about it is like if you're gonna reference Mengele, you're gonna have to like it's a delicate kind of thing because you're gonna have to do something about the fact that we have all these associations with Mengele. You're gonna have to at
Mhm.
least pay lip service to that, but you can't do it in a totally obvious way, right? There needs to be something else going on, and then this like next stanza is like totally throwaway. There's absolutely no point, right?
Yeah, it's throwaway. It's like not even to bring, because I think sometimes you can have like a stanza where it's like just concrete details, but it has a grounding function. But we've had nothing that needs to be grounded. It's just all like concrete, tangible, and bland detail. So like this is
Yeah,
just even more of that, not even any metaphor. Forged paper, okay, we know that he's faking his identity. If
yeah,
just this one of those things, if they gotten rid of the like heavy like grounding images at the start, maybe you could
yeah,
argue for this stance's inclusion, but it's completely like unneeded
yeah.
here. Like,
He has the background in the title. He has this like slipping on another man's skin. He
yeah,
even gives you the assumed name.
and he even like
Then he
he at
has to go
least
back
there
to it
has an
again.
attempt at metaphor, attempt at something that's a little more of a psychological hook, whereas this doesn't even have that. It's just like a few hard candies in the pocket. Is that just like supposed to like be like, oh, he's this like hard, like an image of like what might be in this like regular old man's pocket? Is this sort of this
Yeah, yeah,
attempt at like the banality of evil? Because that's kind
yeah.
of how I read it, but it's like not really that interesting a thing in itself.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah.
And yeah, like first of all, like the banality of evil common like it's been sort of like overused anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's doubtful whether or not, Hannah Arendt was even making like uh, a good point, in that proposition. But at this point, whether or not, it's true, like it's already been accepted as true. So like, are we just sort of doing the same shit over and over again? Like, where are we going here? And yeah,
Yeah.
like, and also this, like, where the water was shallow, kind of like, oh yeah, yeah, we know that, his kind of experience is shallow. And like, I mean, I saw this, I was like, all right, you're gonna have to sort of make some kind of judgment to some degree. Well, this is making a judgment, but you're going to have to really think about the judgment that's going on in this area versus The kind of throwaway obvious judgments of, shallowness and non-constructiveness and all that. But there are some better parts, like you mentioned, the Lipo drowns, trying to
Yeah.
embrace the reflection of the moon in the Yangtze,
See,
762.
like I just thought I think this poem is like it's not like amazing, but I always want to better sections just because honestly it has a bit more of a sense of fun to it. Like it's kind of
Uh-huh.
playing off of like
Exactly.
those like
Yep.
Chinese like the stereotypical like Chinese poet, especially the Lipo, like the like jolly going out getting drunk, but also like philosophizing while drunk. But in nature, it's like it's kind of playing off those tropes, and there's a little bit of like a nudge wink to it in a way that's it's just fun, It has a sense
Yeah.
of fun to it, which the Mengele one just doesn't have. Like I think that counts for a lot. It's not like a fantastic thing, but it's solid. Like and I don't know. I
Yeah.
feel it works because of that.
Let, let,
And it,
let's
it
let's
also has a nice music to it. Like the Mengele one does not have
mhm.
is not particularly musical, and it's like that'd be fine if the image. Like I would say that area of yours, it kind of it's a more like mental and kind of image based build up rather than having like being one that's based around the pure sonic qualities of it. But it's sort of like the Mengele section in this poem, like it doesn't have that interesting ideas, but it also is just not very musical. It's pretty prosaic. Whereas this one does have a little bit more. It's subtle. It has a nice kind of a bit of alliteration, assonance woven throughout, and it just again it reinforces the subject matter a bit more as well because you kind of want to with that lyrical quality to it. Like
Yeah, let's just read this section of the drowning poem on
yeah, sure, I'll
lead
read it.
poem, and we'll speak to some of your comments there. So,
Yeah.
Lipo, this is section 2. Lipo drowns, trying to embrace the reflection of the moon in the Yangtze, 762. The moon is no drinker of wine, so I must compensate. Surely you've heard the crows and nightingales egging me on. The day has dispersed from the courtyards like a gang of sparrows, and nothing is left of the world that is not pecked over, hard and dark as the dream of an apple seed. The young men laugh at an old man drinking alone, but here are my companions, my shadow as loyal and thin as a starved dog, and the moon, his whole face wrinkling with laughter. So when you said, for instance, that it's like playful, like what parts did you think show that?
I think just it's more so like more so those sort of like slightly more lyrical qualities and sort of like even the opening, the mood is no drink of wine, so I must compensate. Like it has a sort of it's like a bit of self-justification there, even on the
Hmm.
part of the speaker. It's like has a kind of a certain wryness to it. So like
Hmm.
even the young man laugh at an old man drinking alone. It's like it has this little bit of a self-deprecating kind of wry quality to it. Like it's getting into like some idea of a persona. Like it's kind of you have some language like the nothing is left of the world is not pecked over, hard and dark as the dream of an apple seed. But it's like even still, like while it's it's not totally mawkish, it's evoking sort of some sense of desolation or emptiness, but like it is doing so using an image that is like at least fairly novel. It's a nice image, it's a nice metaphor that isn't entirely obvious. And um yeah, I just thought it's kind of like it benefits from getting into like an attempt at a persona, at least in the way the Mengele one just doesn't have, So it's kind of like, and it's the persona, I suppose, of an artist as well. So you kind of playing off that artistic persona of Lee Poe as well. That like I mean I haven't read a huge amount of his poetry, at least not in like decent translations, but like a lot of those sort of I can kind of recognize certain images there. Like it's just, it sort of isn't like it's about a drowning one. I don't know if I'm not actually sure of the sort of story behind this. Maybe, I don't know, is it trying to implicate like did he actually drown or is that
Well,
something
I mean,
that's part
yeah, the story is he got, well, the story is that first of all, Li Po constantly is drinking, and
yeah,
one day
yeah,
he's like out in a boat, and he tries to like grasp the reflection of the moon or something, and then drowns or
yeah.
something.
It just sort
Um,
of, compared to how obvious the Mengele one is, like there's sort of, he could have written this one with some implication of like, if you think of it's this drunk guy and he basically kills himself.
mhm.
And like think of how if he had handled this in the like obvious like way he handled the Mengele one, but
Yeah.
instead there is this sense of like using these personas and sort of taking on this like mythic quality to it that I don't know, it's a much more enjoyable poem. There's like a different
Mhm.
angle to it that you can take from that, and
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, to your point, I mean, like just compare the first lines, right? This one, his name then, Wolfgang Gerhard. Okay, we all knew that, right? Versus
Mhm.
this one, the moon is no drinker of wine, right? That's not a conventional image or thought or whatever. Maybe
It's a
it's not.
poetic
Yeah,
register as well of
yeah.
language too.
Maybe like you could say like, okay, it's not maybe as effective as it could be, but I mean, it's a good opening, right? It has
Mhm.
the ambiguity and the interest that makes you want to read more, and then it's like, so I must compensate, right? You know, that is like you said, wry, self-justifying, and also like this, right? Surely you've heard the crows and nightingales. This, by itself would be a kind of like little, sort of trite. I don't know. It could be like one of the worse things that you see in some like 1800s like romantic poetry or
Romantic,
whatever,
yeah, yeah,
right? But instead it's surely you've heard the crows and nightingales egging me on, right? That's a
yeah.
different sort of dynamic going on. And also yeah, like hard and dark as the dream of an apple seed. I mean, that's an interesting image, right?
Yeah.
Dream from the perspective maybe of birds that want seeds or whatever, or apples. Dream meaning, it is perhaps the thing that remains, and dream, some other
Is the
implications
aim of
too.
something like completely like non-human, like not
Yeah,
hard and dark
exactly.
as an apple seed. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean
Yeah.
that's a good unconventional image. Um, and also I would not enjam this in this way. So he enjams my shadow as loyal, next line, and thin as a starved dog. I wouldn't necessarily do it that way. I would probably do like my shadow as loyal and thin, right? And then I would do as a starved dog.
Mm.
Um, but it
It
doesn't really
lets you just
matter too
rest on that
much.
image before
Yeah,
going into the
exactly.
starved dog, which is like a bit more trite in and of itself. But the idea of your shadow as loyal, the idea of the shadow as thin, it's kind of a nice, like
Yeah.
psychological implication for maybe, playing off the fact he's drunk and he kills himself. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And this being a description of water, right? In some way, his whole face
Mm,
wrinkling with laughter. I mean, that's a good image, right? You
yeah.
understand what it means, right? There's rippling, obviously, right, in the water, right? The wrinkling makes sense in that way, right? You don't normally see that association or this kind of description for water, so this is definitely good. But I mean, later on, we don't have to like read all this, but there's like some like mix. There's also like some mixed images and mixed
Mm,
metaphors that don't really work that well. And also, I mean, the very like the another weakness here is like the very last part, the very last section of the poem ends like in a cliche, right? A different beach and swim back, a different man, without knowing if his strength was enough to carry me to shore, right? It's predictable, it's trite, especially for an ending, right? You really have to pay attention to beginnings and endings. You don't want to end a poem in such a trite kind of
mm.
way, right? Especially if like I said earlier, it doesn't have that, it doesn't totalize into anything grand, like in the same way that like you
Yeah.
could you could have like some Wallace Stevens poems, like some of the longer philosophical ones that you can't quite say, oh, it's clearly about this or it's about that, but there's so much interplay within the lines individually from line to line that it doesn't even matter here, because it's lacking a lot of that interplay a lot of that time. The lack of totalization in so many places, it really does harm the poem overall, you know.
Yeah. And it's kind of like um the whole what we know of death by drowning, like it's implying that there is some in itself is implying that there's going to be some sort of totalizing impulse. Not that it has to be expressed really in like an obvious way, but I just don't really think there's much at all. I think the closest thing you can argue is to some sort of circle around or some sort of coherence is the fact that the final poem is about somebody who faked his death and came and used it, who faked his death by drowning and seemed to like use it to come back under a different identity. So there's some degree of like connection there to Josef Mengele using a different identity when he drowned. But like again, there's nothing really kind of done with that, and it's not interesting enough written in itself to even have that sort of implicit connection. Like there's nothing
Hmm.
really interesting done with the psychological implications of either of those things. I think there's a bit more done in the final poem than there is in the Mengele one, but
Yeah.
like it's kind of like it doesn't redo the Wallace Stevens thing where it's kind of you're
Hmm.
not really getting that much at all like out of these, and it's just the hit and miss nature of a lot of the individual sections kind of like works against it in that way too. This is my poem now that well, a draft of one of my poems that I wrote, and it's called Two Bear Cubs Crossed Before My Car. Their world is simple enough, I guess, for metal oddities to be, mere diversion among pristine leaves that dress each tree, and this, morning's first time taste of salmon, snap of bracing blue. The cubs lope on, some barest skip of curiosity is thrown my way. I know irrelevance to those forest ways they go, above the giant firs whisper to their alien sky. Habit reacquaints me to my keys, my road conscripts my hand to turn, foot to lower, gaze to relearn another dozen miles of asphalt. And by noontime's coffee break, those firs have withered, cubs have shrunk comfortably to fit my hand. Yet another amusing excuse to wield against my manager when she confronts my morning tardiness.
Yeah, so I thought this was a very good poem. There's tons of very nice enjambment. There's tons of playing with meaning in unexpected ways, which is exactly what we should have in poetry, right? So first of all, like with the title, right? Two bear cubs crossed before my car. Again, you oftentimes just for people that don't really, if they're writing poetry and they don't exactly know what to do with titles, you could just, for the time being, maybe later on you're going to have different strategies. But one thing that's very simple is just use the title as a means to set the scene, right? The advantage there being it's a way to kind of like formalize what you want to talk about. It centers you, so you don't necessarily go all over the place. It also allows you to have, some subtraction in the sense that now there's like less stuff that you have to do in the poem itself. You could actually spend the time and the energy within the poem, being poetic, right? Being totalizing, being oblique, being ambiguous. And that's the thing, like a lot of the times, like to have that additional layer of ambiguity, it becomes easier to justify once you have a title that can really situate you nicely. Right. So in terms of like what the poem does well, specifically, we have like, for instance, their world is simple enough, I guess, for metal oddities to be mere diversion. Right. We already know there's a car going on. Right. And from their perspective, this obviously would be a metal oddity. Right. This is something strange. This is this is a spectator kind of like essentially looking at a zoo from her perspective, but also from the bear's perspective. This thing is also a kind of zoo, isn't it? Right. It could be a dangerous one, right? But they're also able to have their own sort of objective, assessment of what's happening around them. Right. Metal oddities to be mere diversion among pristine leaves that dress each tree, and this morning's first time taste of salmon. Right. And it's kind of like this nice combination of two things. So I'm not sure if you've ever had this experience, Laura, but very often when I'm eating something and it's like in the morning, I like to step outside. Like for instance, if you bite on an apple and then immediately step outside, the taste in your mouth becomes really enhanced, right? There's something about the air that really enriches that taste. Or something that's even more obvious, if you're, eating something creamy, especially if it's like dairy cream, and then you step outside, that intensifies it that much more. So from the perspective of like, a human being reading this, they're like, oh yeah, I know the taste of the morning. I know what she's talking
Yeah.
about.
Or if you have like pets and you can kind of see that, like,
Yeah.
those sort of reactions in them as well and kind of
Yeah.
compare them. That's what I was thinking of, because I've always had cats and that. And it's like,
Yeah.
I don't like obviously like know enough about a bear, but I can kind of extrapolate or look at like that sort of like animal view of the world and compare it like how it might feel like. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, so like it's like, all right, this would be a person that has this idea of themselves for their own lives, but then suddenly, right, it's of salmon. So this thing, right, we keep kind of like in a sense switching perspectives, right? Objectivity, whether it's from your perspective or the bear's perspective, we keep sort of in subtle ways, skipping in between, right? And the snap of bracing blue, that could also potentially apply to both, right? This snap, right? The kind of like physicality of that. That could be a reference in some ways to a car. It could be a blue car. We don't know. This could be air. This could be the sky. This could be water, right? Obviously, right? If you're going into the water to get salmon. And that's the thing, right? You want the possibility for these kinds of ambiguities. Granted, there are times when you want to definitively and without ambiguity, like, all right, I want this to be the thing. I want this to be the interpretation of this or that line. But generally speaking, right, as a rule of thumb, you want to open up to a multiplicity of meaning rather than closing off the meaning as you progress. And so the Cubs lope on, right? You know, a word that, you know, people might not necessarily hear, but it kind of sounds a little bit
It
of what
sounds
it
like
is.
it looks like. I
Yeah,
quite like
exactly.
that because it's like it's kind of like a playful, bouncy sort of sound to it,
Yeah,
and it's like,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, and so like, and here's the thing, right? The Cubs lope on, and then it's almost as if we're still with the Bears, right? Some embarrassed skip, right? Because these being skip and lope being synonyms, and yet next line, this is why it's well enjambed. Some embarrassed skip of curiosity, right, is thrown my way. We are again going from the objective assessment of one versus the other. We keep moving back and forth. I know I know irrelevance to those forest ways they go above the giant firs, whisper to their alien sky. Habit reacquaints me to my keys, right? This word that's just kind of like standing around. Um, it's something that, you know, most people immediately would kind of have some sort of association with, right? Everybody immediately, if you hear habit, you could quickly think of your own habits, right? Habit in the sense of nature, right? If we have a lot of like naturalistic description here, right? There's a kind of habits of nature, the perpetuities of nature, that sort of thing. But just by sort of like floating here, it almost brings you back. Like if we're sort of switching perspectives back and forth, here it sort of like brings you back immediately to, you know, maybe like a human mental frame. And sure enough, like in the next line, habit reacquaints me to my keys, right? It's almost as if like you stopped for the bear cubs and now you continue to drive on, right? And this is a very nice way of you know, making that an arresting image and just like forcing you to stop where you are and to do that kind of reassessment. My road conscripts my hand to turn. Another very nice image, right? My road conscripts, right? You know, forces me, takes me, has me do something. My hand to turn, right? And this goes back to habit, right? Habit, and again, my road conscripts my hand. In some ways, right? This is not being spelled out, and this is why it works. But this is, you know, if you want to say that animals are more kind of instinctual in various ways, the fact is human beings are also extremely instinctual, right? The habit of the drive, the fact that you are in a road and this road is, you know, it's sort of forging the path for you. If the natural world is forging the path for these bears, then they have to find ways to work around it. The human world of construction is forging you along. You cannot go anywhere other than where this road can take you, right? You might have some decisions along the way, but anyway, my road conscripts my hand to turn, foot to lower, gaze to relearn another dozen miles of asphalt, right? Right. This kind of like, there's almost kind of like a reluctance here, right? There's almost a kind of, you know, emotional connection or perhaps even nostalgia for the naturalistic imagery of before, right? Especially if you're an artist, right? You're constantly thinking, you know, I want to be alone. I wish I could just work on this craft. I wish I, you know, and here to go back to the James Baldwin, everything is a conspiracy against your craft and your art. You know, this could often be a feeling. Gaze to relearn another dozen miles of asphalt. And by noontime's coffee break, those firs have withered. Cubs have shrunk comfortably to fit my hand, right? When I was talking about the other guys, Nick Lantz, he had like this image of it was like what is it, like pearl? What was it? Oh yeah. So like this, there's like another section of the poem where some nights I dreamed what never happened. I held my drowning in my palm. like a giant pearl, right? It's like you held your drowning in your palm like a pearl. What?
Yeah,
Doesn't
it's not intuitive. Like,
yeah. And but here, right, cubs have shrunk comfortably, right? They shrink away in your mind, right? And then to fit my hand, well, what are we talking about here? You're going to be writing a poem, right? This is why it makes sense, right? The person that Nick Lantz is talking about, the guy that faked his own death or whatever, faked his drowning. That's a little, it's a little different. It's harder to justify. Where something like this would work here better because we are kind of like talking about creation in some ways to fit my hand. And then the ending that Laura said that she had issues with like this being a
yeah,
kind of like placeholder, yet another amusing excuse to wield against my manager when she confronts my morning tardiness. So I mean, before we go any further, maybe you have some responses or whatever else.
yeah. Basically, yeah, a lot of what you say, like it's good to hear because a lot of it is kind of what I was going for, like especially in like the third stanza there, like the habit and that, like
Yeah,
that's exactly what I
we
was kind
didn't
of
talk
aiming
about
for.
we didn't talk about these poems beforehand.
Yeah,
We're just doing
so
it
it's
fresh.
it's
Yeah.
kind of, yeah, nice to hear. The thing I had is like really when I was writing this, I was actually inspired by I like random video I seen, like the shorts they have on Instagram and Facebook and that
Hmm.
kind of thing. So I just seen like literally a clip on Instagram of somebody, it was somebody driving and like they stopped and it was like I believe somewhere like maybe in Canada or like in the northern US where like you have like these kind of forested areas and bears because like we don't really have them here in Ireland. Like a lot of our forests have been cut down and that. So it was somebody literally stopping watching these two bear cubs and it just struck me because of how like nonchalant and blasé the cubs were walking past and then like how like entranced the person taking the video was by them and it's just it was interesting to me like just how calm and blasé the cubs were about it. So it's like just I kind of wanted to do something about that then. And as I was writing it, the main thing that I kind of was playing around with first was the perspective. So I started, I think, doing it in second person. And then I kind of thought it occurred to me it's interesting to have it in first person because then you have to like kind of play around with that psychological or character building element that I always kind of like find interesting in a poem. Like when you're looking at the speaker of the poem, the fact that they notice these things and the fact that they notice them enough to in theory talk about them in this poetic way says something about them. So I kind of think what I was like going for with the ending was sort of I was thinking about it's interesting the idea that like you might see these things and like be struck by them enough to describe and to try and empathize with this other species, but also just move on with your human day. And then like, you're maybe on your way to work or you're on your way to go out the rest of your life. And they kind of naturally, like, I'm sure you maybe have had experience like this too, where it's sort of like something happens and then like you go on with your day and later you're kind of thinking back on it, you're like damn, like how did I just move on with my day, as if it's like you compartmentalize it. And I found that an interesting thing because like I find like even I was thinking of maybe in terms of a speaker who wasn't necessarily um themselves like creative for that, so they're kind of like, oh, I had like this impact or this impacting experience that like now what do I do with this, like how does it even fit into the rest of my working day. So I'm kind of, but like then I'm kind of like I guess like when you're writing this way and you're writing in first person, you're creating a certain character, and it's like it's not exactly the same as in a novel or short story, obviously, but there still has to be a certain degree of consistency. So I'm kind of like working on the ending read to have it tied up in a way that seems consistent, in a way that sort of caps things off nicely. I think it could also be what you've said there about like I think you said this also before, like just before we started, where it was kind of you know that it's sort of like they viewed the animal world in this way, that like this sort of detachment, this sort of richness, and the sort of like how do they view the human world of their work. That's something I think I'm kind of still thinking about how exactly to play around with that and how exactly to cap off the poem in a satisfying way, because I'm not necessarily like, if even if it's different than my initial idea or impulse, I'm kind of happy to go with that.
Hmm.
That was
Yeah.
kind of my thinking initially anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works very well. And in terms of the ending, I assume uh, you're thinking maybe of these three lines altogether, but I actually think that this line itself, yet another amusing excuse, works very nicely for what I'm going to say in terms of like, maybe what could be done to improve the ending. Because that's another thing. I'm not sure if you ever get this feeling, but I mean, when I'm writing a poem and I'm at the ending or like something is like not working, I can really feel it. I could really know it. I just like know it, right? Like for me, the way that I do things is I do have a sense of what I want to say when I begin writing, but really the true sense and the inversions and everything else really comes out during the writing itself, which is oftentimes why it takes me so long, right? I throw out a
Yeah.
lot of stuff before I actually
You actually have to write it out and do it to see
yeah.
where it goes. Yeah, I'm the same way.
And so like if you have like yet another amusing excuse to wield against my manager when she confronts my morning tardiness, right? The idea of it being an amusing excuse, it works nicely simply because if we're talking about, you don't necessarily even know that this is I mean, I'm talking to you, right? I'm sort of conflating the narrator with you, but obviously
Yeah.
you don't have to do that, right? This could be referencing anybody, but this is clearly somebody, whether an artist or not, that has like a rich internal life.
Yeah. That's
And
which is like really like why I went with the like I changed the third person. I just thought it's too interesting. It's just far more interesting about the idea of a speaker who can notice all these things and has these sort of reactions, like whether or not they actually do anything with it in the end,
mhm.
which is kind of I think where the crux of what I'm trying to get with this, that like, how does it's basically like how does this actually like slot into their life? How do these kind of experiences slot into like any human's life or whatever,
Yeah. Uh you would expect that this narrator to by having this internal life, if she has like other responsibilities such as work, right? Those things become kind of like, the fan those other things become a distraction, right? And to her, like this experience is amusing, right? And everything else feels like the distraction. So what I would say for the last two lines is, like there's a sense in the poem that everybody here is in a kind of zoo, right? The bears are obviously in a kind of zoo that we have created, right? We have created, we still have forests, but we have carved around these forests.
Yeah.
We have told them, exactly where you can and cannot be. And look, by the way, we're going to put a road here that might kill you. There's that going on. The narrator herself, though, she's kind of like in a zoo as well, right? The zoo of like the maze that she finds herself in, whether it's driving, whether it's the maze of the mind, or whether it's like being at work. What I would do is I would really sort of like go hard on this, like, so yet another amusing excuse, and really make the final part more zoo-like, right? Like you're watching your
Yeah.
manager, your boss, or whoever else, and it's like, these are not my values. I want to work on my craft. I want to think about, things are kind of like bigger and larger in some way. Isn't this workplace, isn't that the real zoo, right? Can't I just objectively and dispassionately look at that and just essentially see animals like anywhere else? Right. So I would really kind of like lean in on that and
Yeah.
maybe do it in a way that's because here you have like a lot of like naturalistic imagery. I would probably do something even like more abstracted and perhaps even like
Yeah.
philosophical, where it really becomes surprising, and it really introduces like a truly like alien quality to it, because in many respects, I
Yeah.
mean, like just like working in general, the way that we work now, it is fairly alien to kind of like generic human experience, prior to, I don't know, the last a couple centuries especially, but maybe the last 10,000 years in general, with farming and all of that. So, and
Yeah, just how abstracted it is from like any kind of actual. Yeah, okay, that's all very, very good ideas. I've just jotted down a few things there to kind of like just think on, just have in the back of my mind for a few days and come back to it. So yeah.
and here actually I have a poem by Dan Schneider. So this is one of the omni sonnets that I picked up and showed you guys earlier. And by the way, I'm going to put links to these books or whatever else that you could buy, both in the video description as well as in the pinned comment, so you guys could take a look at that if you're interested. And I actually gave my comments about like improving like the last parts of Laura's poem after reading this. So, and I didn't really, I did not expect that there would be this kind of connection, but there's also kind of zoo-like thing going on in Dan Schneider's sonnet
Mm.
here that I think Laura could use, and some of its
Yeah.
like weirdness and strangeness, like
Some of the
that
like scientific terms it uses as well, even is like does that pretty
yeah.
well.
And maybe not even
Yeah.
scientific. Like there could be something that's like downright sci-fi, right? That could also
Yeah.
work, right? And just like after reading
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
poem, I was like, oh, this is a way that you could do this kind of improvement. And
Yeah.
honestly, for anybody, that's watching this and trying to work on poetry, one of the main things that you should do is make sure as you're working on a poem, you have like a bunch of, other poems with
Yeah.
you next to you. If you're stuck, read a poem, look through something else. Like even if you're like sometimes I would be reading poems just purely for the sake of writing my own, in the sense that, like, let's say I'm stuck in a line and I'm just looking for a word, just for a word. I'm
Yeah.
literally
Yeah.
sometimes like
That's true.
scanning through a poem like over the course of like 1 or 2 or 3 seconds, just looking for some kind of word that might fit for me, a sound
And
like some
sometimes it's like you read it and you think of it, then you just some way weird unconscious connection that your brain has
yeah
made. It's like not even, yeah, I do the same, like just even have something to skim through. But
yeah
I can actually I'll read this one if that's all
okay,
right.
go ahead.
I've always been fond of this poem actually. But so this is Dan Schneider's On Me sonnet. "'Tis better to live than perceive. My cousin never paid attention to the huge oak tree slowly growing on France Avenue, his youth pursuing selfish inward things, his eyes remaining dim cherubim in the hyena dark of suburban monotony. As the years struck by, they lunged at recognition, until one day his frail body hove back and roared in a reptilian blood. In the colder snows of January winter, my cousin in worse condition than the newfound ophidian flexion of his mind. So he taunted, raved, and clawed at the glaring eyes of the universe, probing his own, a protozoan, under glass. He laughed and suffocated and became what he is, and the tree remained growing."
Now, so if you've been fond of this poem in the past,
Yeah.
what about it?
I think like it has this sort of back and forth in relation to the title. Um that's just quite interesting to look at. Like it kind of plays with the ideas of living versus perceiving, and like kind of, so you have in the start there's a dichotomy set up, or duality. You have the cousin and you have the tree, and it plays out this sort of narrative of of the cousin, as like is he living or perceiving during any of these particular moments of like self-awareness, or of what the poem is describing in the end. So it's kind of like, "'Tis better to live than perceive." So it's sort of like, my cousin never paid attention to the huge oak tree slowly growing on France Avenue, his youth pursuing selfish inward things. So it's like straight away, like in relation to the title, you kind of have this so the cousin obviously isn't perceiving. He's his youth pursuing selfish inward things. I mean, he's living his life, he's following whatever impulses he has. He's not necessarily, his eyes remaining dim cherubim. So straight away it seems like an abnegation or whatever of the idea of perceiving, because the cousin is portrayed as somebody who is selfish and inward. He's like not paying attention to the natural world in this sense. He's kind of constrained within whatever particular impulses or instincts he is within. And then you have, "At the year struck by, they lunged at recognition." I mean, straight away you have, it's not the cousin, or it's not this person lunging at recognition, it's the years. It's as if something outside of himself. Until one day his frail body hove back and roared in a reptilian blood. "In the colder snows of January winter, my cousin in worse condition than the newfound ophidian flexion of his mind. So he taunted, raved, and clawed at the glaring eyes of the universe, probing his own." So it's kind of like it's just, and then suffocating became what he is, and the tree remained growing. So it's kind of playing at the idea, I think, that like how much is the cousin kind of perceiving, how much is he like being set up as, you have the human versus the natural, like a plant, human versus a plant. So that kind of has the obvious, given the title, the whole humans being beings of perception versus just things that are living. But you also have the cousin's lack of perception being set up. You have his kind of this sort of always like this violent language that's used to describe like maybe him coming to some degree of recognition or having it forced upon him, um then that it's sort of like clearly presented as a negative thing as opposed to some degree of enlightenment that might be kind of the typical like way of viewing these things. And like meanwhile then it's like the tree remained growing, it's simply something that's living, it's simply something that is, it's not something that is necessarily having to perceive whatever lack or whatever like condition in the courses of the universe that the human character is having to do here. So it's kind of like I don't know. I think it's a really interesting poem. And also like just purely technically, it's a very interesting one. It has a good use of like I kind of mentioned this, but has a good use of these like scientific and terms, these like Ophidian flexion, protozoan, um like it kind of like it's quite interesting. It's nearly like this sort of alien perspective, like looking at this living creature, like kind of, which again plays off of the title nicely. It's nearly like looking at like some kind of amoeba. It's like reminds me a little bit if you had some sort of alien. It's like, you know, like in Slaughterhouse-5 you have the Tralfamadorians like talking about the like Billy Pilgrim whatever, and it's like, oh, these humans, these like limited creatures. It's that kind of thing going on. That
Mhm.
sort of it's almost like some sort of like, you know, the limited limits of what humans might view as being perception or perceiving, as opposed to just, you know, having this like limited flawed perception, that versus simply living, simply like thriving within their particular environment, which, you know, which the tree then does in the end.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis. I would also highlight, I mean, the title, right? So, "'Tis better to live than perceive."
It's also,
Uh,
yeah, playing off of the
yeah,
better to give than receive too, which like has an extra kind of like punniness going on.
yeah, and I mean, in both cases, right? "'Tis better to live than perceive" versus "'tis better to give than receive." In both situations, right, it's not absolutely clear that that is in fact the case, right? It's not always true that it's better to give than to receive, right?
Mm.
There are certain kind of givers, right? There's a certain kind of giving that could be, you know, fairly negative in quality, and there's a kind of receiving that could be extremely positive. I mean, I often think of like, you know, imagine people that have like a ton, right? I mean, Donald Trump, for instance, let's assume that he's a multi-billionaire and he's, you know, he was able to become president, yet he literally does absolutely nothing with his existence, right? He was a net negative, he was a drain on the world, right? As opposed to being a positive, right? He was given a position to change things politically, right? He was outside the two parties. He had more credibility in that regard. And yet he just did the same old shit that everybody else does, right? He's going to die essentially, done nothing except, you know, party and harm. Right. So that, you know, cliche, it is better to give than to receive. You could sort of debate it in various ways. And
Yeah,
obviously you could debate very easily whether or not it's better to live than perceive.
yeah.
And
I
also
think it
and also
works because it's
the
like
meaning of
it
live and
seems,
perceive, you know?
yeah, it's kind of like working because it's like it's a bit unintuitive because it's like it's better to live to give than receive. It's like a cliche because it has to be said because it's pretty unintuitive to, I guess, a basic sense of greed and like, no, I want stuff, I want more. And it's like kind of similarly, it's like somewhat more abstract and philosophical, but it's still, tis better to live than perceive. It has a little bit of that contrary feeling to it at the same time. Like it's something that would need, that might need to be said because it's like there's like this, you know, the whole idea of like sapient, like human sapiens or whatever, is like inherently viewed as this superior thing, where the, you know, like even still with the knowledge of evolution, there's this idea like humans as being like the most advanced, most superior. You know, it's still this intuitive view, even if it's not coming from religious source, that we're like the pinnacle of evolution or something like that. That perception and the ability to perceive to be sapient and sentient, and that is this special thing that's automatically above everything else. So it's kind of something that straight away you have a bit of the, oh, you're going to sit up and take notice. It feels
Mhm.
contrary. It's a kind of a little hook in that sense.
Yeah. And I mean, like we were talking about like, you know, beginning lines, ending lines or whatever. I've always thought this was fairly clever, right? My cousin never paid attention to the huge oak tree. Um, that in and of itself, right, in terms of like getting someone to pay attention to the first line of a poem, what is your strategy? How are you going to hook them in? this kind of like negative that's like talking about attention itself, is actually hooking you in, right, to the
Hmm.
huge oak tree. And it's kind of like setting this up as go, maybe not like a controlling metaphor. It does other things than be a metaphor, but it is a controlling aspect, right? It is a motif in the poem. Slowly growing in France Avenue, and then this enjambment, right? His youth pursuing, right? Is the youth, is the youthfulness or whatever pursuing him, right? Is he aging in some way, right? And maybe there's like a part of him that wants to kind of like course correct in some way, but instead, right, we get his youth pursuing selfish inward things. And I mean, even when you get the kind of like negative characterization of the cousin later on, still, right, I mean, to the extent that this is obviously a discussion of a human being, there might very well still be something within him that
Yeah,
is
I thought as
trying
well,
to
like
course correct. Yeah.
the second line, it's like the huge oak tree slowly growing on France Avenue, his youth pursuing. So it's like, as well as that, it's I kind of always think it's like the tree is slowly growing, and then like in the same way, this like the young cousin is kind of like pursuing sort of that growth, that natural like trajectory as well towards growth or whatever. That might be a bit more like oblique, but it's always kind of what I think when it kind of has like there's a nice juxtaposition there of kind of like the tree growing, and then the young cousin is obviously like growing too, but in this selfish inward
Hmm.
way then as it continues. So you have that kind of dichotomy like developed a little bit
Hmm.
from the get-go.
And I always thought this was a very nice image, right? So he taunted, raved, and clawed at the glaring eyes of the universe, right? So he's already given, that kind of reptilian quality, right? The Ophidian
Yeah.
thing, reference to a snake, and we have like other references like that. So he taunted, raved, and clawed at the glaring eyes of the universe, right? This is what an animal would do. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, in many respects, like again, like in terms of like trying to find whether it's like this poem or with your poem, we're still trying to find that kind of commonality between the two, right? Human beings do behave in this way. They look at the universe. The universe is, uh, maybe you don't want to use a word like scary, right? Because it's kind of like it might freeze somebody up. But you could say that the universe, in many respects, is kind of hostile, right? At the very least, it's hostile to, the core of your intentions, especially if your intentions happen to be of the kind of sort that we're talking about in this show. You could easily perceive, the universe being glaring at you, threatening you in some way, right? But also, right, we have this part, probing a zone. So we have a very nice image to start, right? The glaring eyes of the universe, but it's these glaring eyes, they are probing his, right? It kind of like essentially, if the universe is scary in many respects, one way to make it less scary is get yourself in a position in life where, as the universe is glaring at you, probing your own eyes, you could stare back and you could say and stand
Yeah.
on exactly what you're doing, right?
It's kind of like we talked about in the Nietzsche show when it's that like, the eternal recurrence thing. Like, would you be
Exactly.
able to like just look at your whole life and just kind of have some sense of peace? Like it kind of comes back to that a little bit. The idea of like this force watching you, whether it be like the universe or in a religious sense, God or whatever, is this sort of overwhelming and terrifying idea for most people. Like it's the idea of like, or even some sort of this sort of an evocation, I feel like in this poem, of the idea nearly this like greater alien intelligence looking at you as if you're like an amoeba or something like that, and like how you would even how any sort of awareness would even cope with like that idea, because it doesn't.
Yeah.
Like,
And,
and
and of
then
Yeah,
yeah.
and of course we have the tree remain growing, right? So you have the tree at the beginning, and you're sort of like imagine this was like a plot in a movie, right? Something that you are intentionally forced to forget, only for it to come back, right? As a kind of like plotting technique. Here, it's not only a plotting technique; it's also one obviously of depth, right? There's ramifications for this. We have the reference to the tree. Absolutely no reference to this here, except the slowly growing part, and then suddenly, not even in a full line, right? It's just a part of a line. It fully comes back here. in the end remain growing. Back to this idea of like the perception. Okay, so it's the tree obviously is living. Is it perceiving in any way? Is it is this really the kind of thing that human beings need to aspire towards, right? This kind of like pure living for the sake of living and responding to all the phenomena around you. And if you do respond, what does that exactly look like? Is the perception itself the thing that mediates the specifics of the response that you deliver? So
Yeah. I think as well, like just to point out like the interesting, like the other half end line as well, the because he laughed and suffocated and became what he is. So
mhm.
it's almost like this, or it has this whole like little
He's
implication of,
ossifying, he's almost
yeah, he's
ossifying into
ossified, and
that.
it's like, and
Yeah.
the tree remained growing. It's basically like there's a straight contrast. Like he did not remain growing. He
Yeah.
just like sort of, he is whatever he is, and he's stuck there. And this is his little origin story. He had
Yeah.
his brief time of perceiving, and he wasn't able to deal with it in whatever way. And like there's like it's one of the things, it's a great poem. Like you can kind of, nothing specific. It's all described in this almost like if there's an alien like looking under a microscope at the human species, and like this is the development of a human in this like completely like in this completely counterproductive, like destructive manner. But you can obviously think of it and sort of imagine for lots of ways in which that might have happened to the cousin,
Yeah.
like his youth pursuing selfish inward things. I mean, what happened to him? Did he end up becoming an addict? Did he end up like just doing all these selfish things and ruining his life? You can sort of like, it's just, you can imagine and fill in the blanks yourself as to what it is, because it's told in this kind of cosmic, like abstracted perspective.
Yeah. And I mean, like that's also to get back to the whole the zoo thing, right? And I think the good ramifications for maybe things you could do in your own
Yeah.
poem. Like the difference between human beings and something like a tree is a tree could potentially grow for centuries or even thousands of years. If a human being wants to grow for centuries or thousands of years, guess what? You're going to actually have to do something. That's the difference, right? A tree could be a tree. You actually have to do something, right? As evil as Mengele is, the fact is centuries are going to pass. No one's going to know his name, right? For like, I guess, historical like scholars or whatever, people that, or like buffs are on this or that, he might be somewhat in the memory still a little bit. But as far as like pop cultural appeal, obviously he is in many respects a pop culture fixation at this point. He closed off any possibility. He's essentially that reptile, right, that Dan Schneider's talking about. He closed off these kinds of possibilities for himself by not doing anything, right? Which is why I'm asking, right? A poem floats better than a body, right? That's the hope. That's the hope that every artist has, that a poem ultimately has more weight to it and also more weightlessness to it than a body, right? And which means if that's in fact the case, guess what? That's not going to be handed to you. You have to make it so. And the only way to make it so is you make sure that the craft of the poem exceeds, whatever it is that maybe your own life is. So anyway, let's I guess move on to the next poem here. Wow, this is take, we should always just assume things are going to take a lot longer than
Yeah.
we think, especially for poems like, we could go on for this shit forever. Anyway, so this is another ario of mine. So this ario and the next two that you guys will hear from me are not fully completed, although this is mostly in a completed state. I just need, just like Laura, for me, I want the last, I want to like reimagine the last two lines, redo them in some way. But this is based on let me just briefly say this is based on a trip that I recently took to New Orleans, and just walking around learning about the environment, the post Hurricane Katrina environment. So many things went south, right? Obviously, homelessness and crime went up, right? There was like more white flight to the extent that white people remained. A lot of them are either, kind of like essentially tourist fixations, or they are the kind of like old school, Southern plantation style mansions and stuff like that. And the schools are primarily now either private, like 70% are either private or charter schools. Charter schools are very controversial in the United States because they compete with resources and they make promises that are false promises. But anyway, they're closing all the schools in New Orleans. and I have an asterisk here under the title, on the flight over, right? So I'm just kind of like, it's kind of like a sneaky way. You only got 10 lines. So let's situate you in the title, and let's also sort of situate things a little bit with this, sort of little, instead of a dedication, it's an asterisk with a little bit more description. And the description is on the flight over. Swallowed to the pit like an old classroom promoting fractions into wholes. A child yaps, I filched an hour from New York. Go right, now, but needed time so needlessly distended it took itself for perpetuity, as if we'd never had a holiday. One could not just mop away on Bourbon Street. Imagine all the janitors kept home, the boys who tried to keep you honest. So the idea behind this poem, if you're imagining on the flight over, swallow to the pit like an old classroom, right? In the pit of a plane. I don't really like taking flights. If I could avoid them, I will. Like an old classroom promoting fractions into wholes. Like it's very ambiguous to start. You're thinking, is that, where exactly is this going? A child yaps, I filched an hour from New York. There is a 1 hour time zone difference between New York City and New Orleans. And whenever I travel somewhere, there's a time zone difference. I always either think like, damn, I either lost an hour or I gained an hour. And either way, right, I got to thinking, because I was thinking of this poem as I was on the plane. I was thinking, all right, so if I'm getting essentially like a kind of hour, it's going to feel like it. What am I going to do with it? Am I going to do something constructive with it? Am I going to waste it? Is anything going to really come of it? And the promoting fractions into wholes, it's like, like even when I'm sitting in a plane, even if I know there's a time hour difference, and I look at the landing time or whatever, and I'm like, all right, let me just do like a calculation. Sometimes it's not an hour, sometimes it's two, sometimes there's like some, minutes that are lagging, whatever, flights, all kinds of things could happen. Right. So it's like essentially kind of like, being a kid, you're dealing with fractions as you're trying to like figure out what's going on with the time. And the child yaps, right? A filch an hour from New York, right? The child being a kind of like, I guess, from the perspective of the narrator, the child is kind of like that internal voice. Okay, you got that hour. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to waste it, or are you going to do something with it, right? So now there's like this authority figure. It could be a teacher. It could be, your own internal authority, whatever, right? That authority figure, that voice starts to, peek out and say, okay, you've been discovered, Alex. You really better do something with this hour. You better not waste it. And you specifically better not waste it, Alex, because you're going to a place that against, their own consent, right? They never consented to have their city laid to waste. And yet, everything from climate change and hurricanes that people are not really doing much about, to the fact that social services are allowed to erode in this way, right? They don't have these kinds of choices. If they get that extra hour, they might be able to do a lot more with it than you will. Because if you have so many hours that you get and this is all leisure time for you, you're not going to respect it necessarily like someone that has a ton of privation might respect an hour or anything that they might gain, right? That's another kind of very sick sort of phenomenon, right? The people that tend to accumulate resources are the same people who no longer, use these resources because they want to just like, fuck around or whatever else. Right. So we have this like phenomenon being described. Go right now. Again, it could be a teacher, it could be your own internal voice. Right. I'm sort of leaning a little bit to the teacher because with the italics and with the kind of voice, right, and the kind of like talking with the children in the classroom, that could be the thing, right? But needed time, right? And how many people felt this? But needed time, so needlessly distended, it took itself for perpetuity, right? I remember like one time my mother-in-law was over here and we were supposed to go somewhere, and it got pushed back by like half an hour. So then I started lounging around. I started like, as she was like, he's acting like this 15-minute or 30-minute delay is like a 5-hour delay, which is so true. My mind often works that way. If I'm given something a little extra, I tend to treat it as if it's more than what I in fact have. Yeah. Right. So, but needed time. Right. It's kind of like, the enjambment, obviously, right. Go right now, but needed time. It's as if I'm saying I needed time, but really, no, the necessary time, the needed time. So needlessly descended, took itself for perpetuity. right? And then going back to what I said earlier about maybe what other people feel or deal with when it comes to fewer resources, as if we'd never had a holiday. I'm acting as if I have so much, privation, or the narrator is, right, that nothing actually happens, right? I'm acting as if like I'm going in this holiday, and it's as if like, I'm so out of control because I've never had it before in my life, right? Which is, there's like a pathetic quality to it. And it's as if we'd never had a holiday. One could not just mop when Bourbon Street. So this might be a little bit esoteric, maybe to anybody that's not been in New Orleans, but Bourbon Street is one of the most well-known streets in New Orleans. It's in the French Quarter, which is kind of like the tourist area. And Bourbon Street is one of the busiest streets where you just see, it's one of those places where like at night, it's mostly just like young people just
Everyone drinking and like,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
partying and that kind of thing. Yeah.
drinking, vomiting. New Orleans is known as like, all right, do not step into any puddles, because the puddles are not just water. They're piss, they're garbage, they're alcohol, they're vomit, they're all this stuff, right? Very distinct set of smells, in that area, right? So, and I'm just kind of like making fun of like, this idea that, like don't act if you have resources, if you have anything, don't act as if like you're out of control, as if like you've never had this opportunity to relax, right? But this is also like being enjammed in a way where, are your experiences merely going to be this? Are they just going to be mopped away by somebody on this like street where everybody's drinking and pissing and shitting and vomiting and whatever, right? Is this really going to be your life, right? And if it is, isn't that kind of pathetic? Because the rest of New Orleans, they're not in Bourbon Street. Okay. They have their own shit to deal with. They have an actual life to deal with, real life shit. And you have to be hyper aware of that. And I mean, the next two lines to me, they just fall kind of flat, right? Imagine all the janitors kept home. This idea of like, janitors being like a very important job, right? This is a value kind of positive description of what's going on, right, with their work. Imagine all the janitors kept home, meaning, if no one's there to clean up Bourbon Street, you're not going to have tourist attractions, right? You're going to have nothing at all, right? Imagine all the janitors kept home. You're thinking the idea, okay, there's nobody to clean it up, but really they're talking about their own boys, right? The boys who try to keep you honest, going back to these children, right? The internal child telling on you, this fucking guy has this time now. What is he going to do with it? Teacher, 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 make him do something, right? And instead of getting mad at them, these are the boys that try to keep you honest. And also, I mean, being a teacher, right? And also this reference to the schools or whatever, children, they definitely do have a way of keeping you honest. There's certain things that you can and cannot do. You have to be on your best game, because if you're not, they're going to see right through it. So anyway, I don't want to talk more about this poem. I guess I'm going to ask for your reaction.
I think like I can kind of see what you mean in terms of like you developing this metaphor and like the ending two lines maybe not having the punch you'd want. I kind of feel as well. I think the first line or the first line isn't bad, but I'm not like
Which
sure what
line?
I'd say exactly.
Which
Just
line?
the first line of
Oh,
the
okay.
poem
Right.
proper. I don't know. I feel there's more you could do in terms of an opening to sort of set up that might then kind of play into giving the ending a bit more punch. It's not
Mm-hmm.
a bad opening line, but I feel like the rest of it you kind of have like it doesn't I feel like it doesn't sort of ground the like setting of the poem or the sort of connection between this like basically it's the mentality, the classroom mentality versus like this sort of real life setting of the plane. Like I feel there's I don't know. I feel that could be done better. I'm not entirely sure how, or I'm not entirely sure
Mm-hmm.
what, to be honest. So I'm very vague, but it's just kind of a feeling that the first line itself could kind of ground or pull you into that more. Because I feel like after that, it proceeds in its sort of like promoting fractions into whole a child yaps, I filch an hour from New York, go right now. And from there, like the child versus like this sort of authoritarian, like teacher voice, it then sort of proceeds into this metaphor, but it like works well in a very intuitive way. But I feel like the transition from that, like the whole setting of the flight as established in the asterisk bit, like I feel it needs a bit of something more to sort of tether the two metaphors together, if that makes sense. And I'm not
Yeah.
entirely sure what. It's just that's kind of my intuitive feeling about it. I think then depending on how you went with that, that might be kind of give you an idea, more of an idea of how to tie then the ending back into it.
Hmm.
Because yeah, the idea of the janitors and then twisting on that, I think is a strong idea. But
Hmm.
yeah, especially because the like mop away at Bourbon Street, it's like a way of sort of it's like one of those like, you know, the little magic eye images you turn this way and that. So like one side it's kind of like you have this like metaphor going. It's nearly like the holiday in New Orleans versus this like kind of that classroom idea of it, and then the sort of political thing. But I don't know. I think like if you had a way of sort of tethering those metaphors together in a way that just kind of like made it work more intuitively, I feel that would kind of help the poem overall. Now that's just, I don't know, that's just my opinion. I'm not other, it might be your mileage may vary kind of situation, because it's not swallowed to the pit like an old classroom. It's not a bad line in itself. It's just it is quite an abstract start, which in itself isn't bad, but especially because you do have the on the flight over, it's just kind of I'm wondering maybe it's a bit like too kind of abstract or whatever in itself.
I mean, perhaps in some ways, I never even actually thought that the first line was the issue. I mean, because originally when because I did actually show you this poem
Yeah,
before,
yeah,
and
I remember
basically
seeing.
what I said was like, I feel like this needs to be a kind of because Ezekiel Yu he wrote a double ario that worked extremely
Yes,
well.
yeah,
And eventually we're gonna have him on one of these like poetry shows because he has like at least a couple of poems that should be brought out and discussed. And so originally I was like, this needs to be maybe like a double area of some sort to like develop the argument more,
yeah,
right?
the
To
New
have like a
Orleans and
more,
New York kind of, yeah.
yeah. But then when I'm looking at it again, it's like there has to be like some way to make this work, especially since like I mean the core of it I think works exceptionally well. I mean
Yeah, I think
I
the core of it does work well.
yeah,
It's just nearly like
yeah.
kind of I can get why you like I know, because it's like it's not a bad starting line in itself. I think it's nearly that the middle, it feels like the start and end kind of doesn't like ground nor cap off like the middle, because the middle section from about like the second, third line, the first stanza, like the bit you've highlighted there, develops the argument really
Hmm.
well. And it just doesn't feel then like the start and the end nearly flows out of that
Hmm.
as
Yeah.
naturally. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't quite have that, even with the Mengele one, where there's this illusion where like each of the sections is building on each other and they just feel like they're each is building on the next. Like it's very like this one doesn't quite flow as organically
Hmm.
or kind of
Yeah.
have that back and forth. Like aside from in that section, it does. That the
Yeah.
bit you like even the child yaps of Filchnar from New York. Because then like you kind of do have a bit of like the child versus that teacher voice. So it's nearly like an internal dialogue of kind of like these different parts or whatever, which like that's quite an interesting approach. It's just yeah.
Yeah.
Um
I mean, is it
yeah,
interesting? It is interesting though how kind of like we both instinctively know, and I knew when I was writing it, I was like, because I really because I had like a good idea for how to like turn this into a YouTube short, but I was like, I can't do that because I am not. And that's the thing, like most people like viewing these shorts, it's not like they would even understand. Like if I were to just put up this poem versus literally any other, they wouldn't know necessarily like qualitatively the differences, but I know, and both of us
yeah,
know right now that there's like some sort of insufficiency here. We can't quite get it where we want it because I mean I wrote this poem something like a month ago, so we can't get it exactly where we want it, but we know that it's there. I know that there is some kind of insufficiency here, and I know this even if like this is a fantastic like center for a poem. Yeah, so it is interesting that we're both in the position because that's the thing with like poetry. You read enough of it, then you write enough of it. It really is kind of like learning a different language, and the only people that you could really talk to about it are people that know that language, right? Which is why I think these workshops are going to be so useful, right? The vast majority of people that either read poetry or think about it, they don't necessarily know the lingo. And knowing the lingo would also prevent you from just putting this up there because you have a great video for a YouTube short, right? It's like that's not enough, right? You need to be
yeah,
honest with yourself, right? It doesn't matter about the clicks or the views. you first need to be honest with what you have, right?
Yeah, I think it's like an intuitive thing though as well, because sometimes like I know with some of my own stuff I've written, like even some I think one of the other one I think I'm doing next on this, I'm just like I'm not sure if it needs something else, but I'm not entirely sure what. And I think like a lot of it is like I think with this I'm trying to put my finger, I think it's like doesn't like it feels like you kind of like to compare it to your earlier the deteriorating life as one from the start it has this like very strong rhetorical sense. It kind of pulls you into it. It's like somebody like you can hear this argument that's been made, whereas like this poem doesn't really start with it. It feels it develops that with the like a child yaps a filch an hour from New York, go right now, but needed time. It's like you can sort of see the voice coming into itself. It's like this internal dialogue, whereas the start I feel like the start and the end doesn't quite feel in keeping with that. It doesn't
Mhm.
feel like it kind of like it flows. It feels like okay, this is a setup and an ending, but it doesn't have that sense of cohering as part of this sort of odd internal monologue that's going on. I feel like a lot of the time that's how like the area form lends itself to that. It's like just an odd internal monologue of a person um,
Yeah.
in whatever way, shape, form, like whether it's that rhetorical argumentative kind of approach that you take, whether it's like, some of Bruce's takes or some of Zeke's takes that he's written on, or some of the ones I've done.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it just feels more, it feels more, it's kind of okay, it's there, it's establishing something, but it doesn't quite feel in keeping, it doesn't have the almost monologue quality to it.
I really do want to keep even the first stanza, but I wonder. But I mean, if I do that, the only way that that's possible, maybe, is if I figure out and the frustrating thing is that there literally is like some combination of lines, or rather, yes, lines and words for these last two lines that would literally, make all this work
Yeah, it would
fantastically. Right.
contextualize it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There is something. I know that it's there, right? Language is powerful enough that you could save almost anything, right, with enough
Yeah.
ingenuity.
If it's
Um,
good, you can like do it. And it's like that's what I mean. They're good. Like the first line, the second line as well as that. Like it's like I think that fits when it works. It's just yeah, it's contextualizing in a sense that you have it kind of gets pulled into this overall meaning in more than just the most immediate obvious ways, which I feel like the earlier like the deteriorating life as one did that well in the sense you have like what hope means for that, what losing it all means. There's like a multiple different interpretations for that
mhm,
that only get like strengthened and reinforced as the poem goes on. Whereas like I think that you don't get that so much with the imagery at the start and end of this. Like it doesn't have that contextualizing,
mhm.
like it doesn't have that sense of like a gravity is pulling it into like this whole thing that makes sense. I think that's really what it is. Whereas like the child, like you're closing the schools in New Orleans, the child you have to filch an hour and go right now. You have enough there that it's sort of like all fitting within this like kind of classroom, this sense of a child versus a teacher, this sense of time. It kind of reminds me a bit of like, when you have like a snow day from school or something like that. It has enough like familiarity to kind of work on that intuitive level. Whereas like, yeah, it's just the rest of it is kind of just lacking that hook, or it's lacking a way to sort of fit into that in a way that gives it a bit more dimension. So yeah, I'd be interested in seeing where you take for that, because like I'm not personally, I think like you're saying it's a bit more subtle. It's maybe just taking playing around with a few different combinations of images and that to get something that fits, because I'm not really sure how exactly to go about that.
Mhm. Yeah.
But
I
yeah.
mean, there's various iterations, right? First, it was like just all on a plane, and then it was like, well,
Yeah.
damn, I really got to get the Bourbon Street in there. But anyway, maybe
I
that's
think
that.
that works because it's nearly like it does sort of strengthen the like actual real aspect, the holiday aspect. It grounds that in a reality of the speaker, um, and kind of contrasts or makes it clear like the kind of like metaphorical aspect of this school. It's like the internal memories and or the internalized sense of like that kind of childlike, like snow day or like school being shut down, that
Mhm.
kind of feeling. I feel like having like the real reference to Bourbon Street as being a place that you actually are, it works well. It has enough of that grounding aspect to it. So
Yeah.
that is a good choice, I think.
All right. Well, I think that's enough on an unfinished poem. Let's get to your next one.
Oh yeah. This is one I'm like at the ending, at the ending again, but like it's one of those ones I'm kind of I read it. I was trying something. It's a kind of a small one. So it's to the spider on my lampshade. Your steady work is being displayed in shadow on my empty page. Why can't I match with ink the pledge of cobweb your devotions made? For nature set your purpose clear, as it left my own obscure, and only mine my whim may spurn, but only mine may be held dear beyond necessity's demands. No waiting flies, no hunger's cage need constrain my webs engage with all that sprawls beyond its strands. What lonely, prayless purity has set my halting pen so free? So
Um,
yeah, I'm kind of like
do you want to
yeah.
comment or should I comment or what?
I think maybe if you actually comment, I just want to say I'm kind of like it's one of those ones. It's a small idea for a poem. It's kind of I wanted to play off of. I think there's a lot of tradition of like spiders as a metaphor, and that's obviously like that's going to be in the back of my mind when I'm writing this. So I wanted to play off that. It's a little bit as well like the whole. I think now that since you mentioned like Dan's tis better to live than to perceive, it kind of plays into some of those like the human um and like some of the ideas that like I brought up in the other poem as well. I wrote these around the same time, like the sort of like natural world and its instincts versus this idea that we are like more advanced as humans and more free in some ways. The main issue I have is that like I'm kind of building up this rhetoric and I feel like it needs possibly more ending. I may go as opposed to the sonnet approach. I'm kind of thinking maybe of making the last just the last final quatrain instead of a final couplet, just because I feel it needs a little more building up of the rhetoric. But I'm kind of just like
Yeah.
it kind of similar to yourself with the other poem, just kind of deciding how exactly to do that. And it's just a matter of trying it, of kind of trying out and trial running some of it. But
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I would say one of the similarities is that, okay, so if we have like, I think this is a fantastic core here in the middle. I think this, especially here, like this is a fantastic core right here, right? Like literally, like if I were, if you were to like cut away this and that, right? And I just have like a little bit of a sense of what it's about. This is like a burgeoning to me. This it feels and sounds and looks like a burgeoning, like really great poem, right? Right. And
Mm,
only mine, my whim may spurn, but only mine may be held dear. That's like a great way right before, right? We have because I mean this is a sonnet. Right before the sonnet has its kind of like turn, right? And only mine, my whim may spurn, but only mine may be held dear beyond necessity's demands. Right. I could imagine a poem that has exactly this like look and feel and this combination of words with like, total greatness in the end as well. Like the first thing I noticed in terms of like improvement is there's this thing in the middle, right? So like for nature set your purpose clear as it left my own obscure. Uh there's too much similarity in the sense of like antonyms, right? These are too clear. They're too much of like a set of clear antonyms for it to really
it's
del
too
to,
obvious
to
kind of like
to deliver on the promise of this. Like there's a lot of ambiguity and strength here, right? Whereas here it's like, all right, for nature set your purpose clear as it left my own obscure. That sort of duality, it's a little, it's a little too obvious, both in the phrasing as well as the idea. So I think a lot actually would hinge on specifically what would happen here. Some of the kind of like lesser poems with nonetheless like good little observations that Hazel Hall would have,
yeah.
right?
Like I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, this has a lot of that feel. But even so, I mean, like I think one of the best things is also the opening line, right? Your steady work is being, right, comma displayed, right? That's a fantastic little way, right? Because it's like your steady work. Because if this is just kind of like all audio, right, you wouldn't even necessarily know that there's a comma there without because even if you do a pause, you won't necessarily feel it,
Yeah,
right?
it's
But
not registering. It's one of those little grammatical things that like I kind
yeah,
of picked up off of like Dan oftentimes, or like
hmm
would kind of talk in terms of that. And
yeah,
or even like Jessica, I feel like in her poem she like gets a lot of mileage out of like the kind of contrast between enjambment versus those little grammatical things. So I kind of like
hmm
I kind of picked that up there. So I feel it works pretty well.
yeah.
And
So
it gives enough of, yeah, like you have enough of those little ambiguities there to kind of offset that. So I get what you mean. It is kind of, I think like 5 to 6 when I was writing it, I kind of thought, right, I'd have some one of those more obvious things to kind of set up and lead into the more ambiguous kind of differences that I want to get into. But like if like then from like your feedback that I probably don't need that. I'm kind of, I think like in the past I definitely have kind of sometimes written stuff that's a little too obscure or a little like not grounded enough. So sometimes I feel like I kind of tend to overcorrect a little bit
mhm.
and make it maybe, like basically what's here in lines 5 and 6, just kind of like it's too obvious stuff. It's not necessarily necessary to build up the rhetoric or whatever. It's just like, okay, it just ends up being a little bit filler-ish or something. So
Yeah. And honestly, I would maybe like reflect specifically on what we're saying here, right, in the editing process, and maybe apply it to the poem in terms of like instinctually what you feel like. So for instance, this ending, what lonely, prayless purity has set my halting pen so free. I wouldn't necessarily use this word, but something like so being a kind of like, positive idea. A word like to, again, I wouldn't necessarily use that word, but something that has a bit of a negative feel in the sense that
yeah,
in the sense that the spider has a set of constraints, has a structure, right, has a nature that is obviously a lot simpler than human nature and human industry, cobwebs for instance versus poetry, right, and that kind of like more confined space, a spider would be, a spider will more easily reach, let's call it, a stage of perfection than a
yeah,
poet could.
exactly. Yeah.
And I would probably reflect on some of these differences in a somewhat, maybe halting negative sense, as opposed to, the positivity of like, oh, look, like, isn't it so wonderful that I could write poems and not
To be
have,
honest,
prey.
that's what I was more so going for. It's more so this like weight of freedom. I kind of like wanted there to be like a somewhat or like ironic edge to it that I don't know if it comes across or
Hmm
like obviously it doesn't. Like that's kind of more so I was going for it. That's why I felt I needed another quatrain to really develop that as opposed to an ending couplet.
hmm
So yeah, that's kind of I did want to play around a little bit with like there being a nearly ironic edge to the final couplet, but I think that would come across better and I'd be able to develop that more in a bit longer because like
hmm
with the so like it's a little bit I think in my head I was like thinking of it in this like ironic sort of way, like, okay, I'm free, but like what am I actually doing with that? Like
Yeah.
it's this kind of like, oh shit, like what it's this responsibility, like what can I actually do with that as opposed to like, okay, the spider isn't free in that sense, but they're doing a hell of a lot more within those constraints. So yeah, I think that definitely like that's kind of actually just what you say about the soul, like that's actually exactly kind of what I was thinking. But I feel like yeah, it definitely needs more development. It doesn't come across really like to the degree I'd like it to. So
hmm
yeah.
And I mean, I wouldn't go crazy about this if it's not
Mm.
working out, because you're saying, maybe you need another quatrain or whatever. But if it were me, maybe I'm biased like towards sonnets or whatever. But I
Oh,
would
I love the
definitely,
sonnet.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would definitely keep it as a sonnet simply, and similar with the structure. Like I would keep, you would change maybe something here and something down there. But again, this part I think is so particularly strong, specifically, for a sonnet and how that, 8 versus 6 line
Yeah, the
interplay.
turn. Yeah.
Yeah, that I would keep it as a sonnet, and I would not touch anything like, the phrasing, the music. Like I would keep it, very close to this, and just like really feel the how this feels, how it sounds, how it looks, and everything that it calls to mind. And maybe this
Build
is
up. Yeah.
yeah, this maybe is essentially the cobweb. This is the structure. If everything feels like a little too, loose and insufficient, I would use this as a kind of fulcrum for the first half and the second, and keep
Yeah.
keep it as a sonnet. And I mean, who knows, maybe sonnet is not going to work, but if you can, I would keep it as a sonnet. Because again, like just reading these 3 lines, I can 100% imagine this being like a classic, great sonnet, right? At some point. I mean, like again, there's always a combination of lines and words that you could do here that would turn this into a great sonnet, right? It's always
Yeah.
there. The annoying
I
part,
think like
and that's the
yeah,
annoying
I
part, right? Knowing that it's there, right?
is
And
there. Yeah, that's the hard part. I think as well as that though, like it's part of the reason I like working on sonnet. Sometimes like you can just like change like one or two words. And even like it's sometimes like a rhyme, just like hey, okay, what else what can I do within this rhyme that's just a bit more interesting? Like you were saying earlier as well, looking through other books. Cause like I'll do that a lot. I have a few books that I like usually keep with me just to kind of like flick through that like oftentimes have interesting
mhm,
choices. Like some of the Rilke translations I feel like have quite interesting and like Plath as well. And
mhm.
I like actually just because I mentioned I do find like some of Dan's and Jess's stuff is like good for those like little grammatical things and like little like twists on words like that because I feel like they like both use that as a in their own ways, but they use that as a technique in a very conscious way that I feel like you don't see in a lot of older poetry. So yeah, stuff like that. I find like that's kind of what I enjoy about sonnets though. Like you can just change with a couple of little things and it carries a lot of weight. So yeah, I think I'll play around with that, yeah, and it kind of needs a bit, it just needs a bit of extra something. Like it just needs a bit of like, and use that as, like saying, like use that as the core, like use that like rhetorical feel to try and get the rest of it. So yeah, I'm very like it's one of the, it's a bit it's annoying. It's kind of like you at the like New Orleans when it's just like it's in that annoying stage where you know it could be better, but you're not entirely sure how, and it's just trying and erroring it until you find some you hit on something.
Do you want to talk about some of these external poems for the public show, or do you want to move to the patron only feed?
Um, Maybe go to the patron only one now. I'm cool with that.
Okay, the share then, right? So I mean, people are going to want to take a look at our faces at the end, right? They would feel like, damn,
Yeah,
show it at the beginning, you left without showing our faces at the end. So,
yeah,
and again, like if you want that parasocial element, right? You see my face, you see her face. If you want to cultivate this, this simulation of a relationship, that's patreon.com/automachination. You're going to get 2 more poems from me. Also, slightly rough, not totally finished, although they're mostly finished. I would say one of them might be completely finished. Maybe by the end of the conversation is what the conclusion that I would come to, but also a bit more personal, maybe stuff that I wouldn't quite make so public. And we're going to discuss also again the John Ashbery poem, the opening poem here, and we're going to discuss a poem by Robinson Jeffers as well, and another poem from Laura. So thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe. Just keep a lookout on new videos are going to be coming out in the next couple of days as well. So thank you guys for watching.
cheers.